Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are going to wait just a few moments while we allow folks to come in to the webinar. And if you could be so kind, please utilize the chat. We would love to see who is with us today. We'd love for you to put your name and where you are joining us from. So if you could do that while we wait to get started, we will be getting started in just a couple of minutes. So thank you. We have a lot of people joining us. This is wonderful. Okay, I think everyone is ready. This is a juicy topic, something that we can really sink our teeth into. So we are going to get started in just a few moments. We're letting everyone be admitted into our room, and we will also have we have special guests who may be joining us from Facebook. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But we are just letting folks come in, and I see a bunch of great folks coming in from all over. It looks like I see the Midwest, the South, Jersey. Yeah, let's hear it for Jersey. We see it the West, Pennsylvania. We have folks from all over who are joining us. This is wonderful. We are just waiting. I think we are about to level out with the number of people who are joining. That helps me to understand whether people have gotten themselves situated. They have come home from work or had their dinner and joining us with dessert. Welcome everyone to American Friends Service Committee, our Community Safety Beyond Policing webinar. This is the latest in our series of webinars on this topic. The topic today, as you can see from the slide, is policing and white supremacy. So we are going to have a lot to talk about tonight. We have a powerhouse panel and so much wonderful information to share, much food for thought, things to generate ideas moving forward. We have been running these webinars for about a year now, and it has been wonderful. We have been trying to reach a balance between hearing from organizers from everywhere, people who are scholars, and we also have been trying to make sure that we have time for some small group discussions and community conversations so that we don't just hear the information, but we get a chance to digest it together and talk about what we have heard. And as we are now moving into maybe a more mature phase of what we're doing, we've decided to try something a little bit different tonight. And for the first time in this series, we are streaming this event concurrently on Facebook via a Facebook Live. So hello to all of our folks who are joining us on Facebook. And also, because our panel is so dynamic, we want to make sure this time that we are devoting our entire time to hearing from them, because there's so much valuable and really important information that's being shared. We want to make sure that we have a chance to get that out. But it doesn't mean that we are forgetting about the conversation. We know that that's really important. People oftentimes will want to have a lot of time to digest what they have heard. So we also are going to want to invite you to join us again to continue the conversation in a part 2 for policing and white supremacy. We are going to be having a community conversation on July 22nd at 8 p.m. Eastern time. And this will really give us an opportunity to really dig into our thoughts and feelings about everything that we've heard tonight and talk about how we can best move these concepts on community safety beyond policing and really share how we can use these concepts in our local communities and our local organizing. And we hope that you will join us. I believe that there will be a registration link that has been dropped in the chat. I'm trying to see, I cannot see my chat, but yes, indeed, we do have the registration in the chat. So if you want to right now, you can register for via that link that's in the chat if you want to do it. And if, just in case you're busy, you're multitasking, not able to catch it quite yet, we're going to probably put it in the chat again at the end of tonight's session. So without further ado, let's move on and we can get started. If we can move to the next slide, we consider ourselves to be a learning community. And as a learning community, we thought it might be helpful to have a few agreements as we spend time together during this session. As you can see here, we just want to say, hey, we are all learners. There's a lot of good information from very knowledgeable people who are sharing from their research and lived experiences, but we are all learning and we all have something to contribute to the topic today. And we want to practice that. We want to encourage people, if you have ideas and thoughts, let's utilize that chat. That's what the chat is there for. We really, whether you're on Facebook or you're on here on the Zoom link, we really want you to put your thoughts, your ideas into the chat. And we want to encourage you particularly to use the chat when we're prompting you, because there are going to be particular times during today's session where we're going to ask you to use the chat, but we also ask, just as we'd be respectful if we were in person, that we not use the chat when people are speaking, because they are going to be sharing incredible knowledge, and we want to make sure we're giving them our full attention. And we also just want to say that we're striving to create a very brave space, and we want people to lean into discomfort, because they might have some feelings of discomfort, and that's okay. That's how we know we're learning. If there's anything else that people think need to be added to that agreement, I think this would be a good time to kind of pop it in the chat so we can see it. If there's anything else that we are missing from how we need to come together, I'm not seeing anything. Usually I would see something by now. Okay. And if we see something, we'll be sure to loop back. If somebody has a thought later on, then we'll be happy to loop back and share that and see if everyone agrees to that. If you have just joined us, we do encourage you to, if you have not already, please put your name and where you're joining us from into the chat, and we are going to get started. So now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over the proverbial mic over to my very, very accomplished colleague, Nathaniel Phillips, who's with our California Healing Justice Program, and he's going to take it from here. Nathaniel?
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. Thank you, Laura. We're going to start with a poll before I introduce myself. We want to kind of get a feeler for where folks are coming into this space on this topic. We can go to the next slide. So we want to start off, it's like a kicker of a question, and there is no right or wrong answer, but obviously we're about to delve into a whole webinar on what we are thinking. So you can drop into the chat 1, 2, or 3, and also on the Facebook Live. But how do you think that white supremacy shapes policing in the United States? This is kind of our icebreaker question. Do you think it's fundamental to the project of policing, and therefore police are endemically structurally racist, which is a word we hear really often these days? Do you believe that historically police forces may have operated through racism, but it can be rooted out, and these practices can be reformed through, through practices like better training, better tech like body cams, and increased officer diversity? Or do you believe that police are not racist, and rather they're solely concerned with crime, responding to crime, preventing crime, helping senior citizens get their groceries, get cats down from the trees, playing basketball with the community kids? Let us know what you're thinking. We'll give folks a moment. And I'm gonna look at the chats as they come through as well. Cool. So feel free. Okay, the poll is now closed. Okay, so most of us are thinking that white supremacy is fundamental to the project of policing. So this is definitely the webinar for you to be in. We had about, so far, 59% We can move on to the next slide. I'll let you know who I am and also introduce our other participants. So my name's Nathaniel. Again, I'm a fellow with the Healing Justice Program of the American Friends Service Committee. And we focus on advocacy around prisons and policing, but most certainly with an abolitionist framework and with an abolitionist critique. And we're also folks who have been directly impacted by the project of policing. So in particular, without getting into like my whole story, I have suffered police abuse and intimidation. And I'm of the belief that when the police target poor, racialized, queer, and disabled individuals, which are all identities that I carry, then the system is working exactly as it should. It's not broken. It's not a bad apple. It's not a one-off. That's actually the system working as designed and perpetuating itself. And we have our other speakers who will join throughout this webinar. This is going to be conversational. I'm not an expert, although I've read an inordinate amount, including from some of these writers and thinkers in the past couple of weeks. But really, we want to hear from them. But I will bring in some background context as we begin. We can move to the next slide. And a quick shared understanding, white supremacy is a term, like many political terms and social cultural terms that get thrown around a lot. It does have different meanings and people understand it in various ways. I think really recently, we are hearing the terms like white supremacist or extremist, and white supremacy being related to domestic terrorism. But our understanding of how I'm operating is that it is an all-encompassing system and a cultural force. It's a generative phenomenon. So it's not static, it evolves to maintain its power. And it's often unnamed and unmarked. So when we don't talk about it, it's still, when we don't name white supremacy or whiteness, it's still operating around us, between us, in the background, subconsciously, explicitly. And often white supremacy in our country, although we have laws that are supposed to prevent and make illegal racial discrimination, whiteness still often operates within the sanction of law, and it's important to understand that. And we are all operating within the cultural system of a white supremacist settler colonial nation, and have upheld to different degrees white supremacy, whether internalized or implicit or explicit to other folks. We go to the next slide. Thank you. So to kind of ground us in the present before going way back to the past, it's something that's still in everyone's mind, the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. And so I just wanted to briefly show some images here because it really reverberates, what we see in these images reverberates and is predicated upon so much from the past. So obviously the first time that the Confederate flag was hoisted and waved around the halls of Congress, but more specifically to this conversation about police, it was a major police blunder, or was it? We have 35 Capitol police officers under investigation for or surrounding the events at the January 6th insurrection. And then there are also 39 officers from 17 states across the country that are under investigation for participating or for showing up. And so you can see in the picture on the right, like there's a group of people rushing this, like some side steps of the Capitol. Some of them are armed. And then you have the Capitol Police kind of just hanging around. They don't really look alarmed. And then they were overrun. So there's still lots of questions that surround what exactly happened, but it's interrelated to all the things that we're going to get into. But it's also not. White supremacy it manifests in so many different ways beyond policing. Next slide, please. So we'll quickly go over a really brief history of policing in the US. which they were organized forces that followed two trends of historical development in this country. You can go to the next slide. So we can like talk about how policing began in the North. We have to remember that, you know, the United States began as a settler colony of Great Britain. So lots of things we borrowed from the colonial power. The earliest kind of police forces were borrowed structures like night watches, constables, and other officers that were already existing in Great Britain, and then settlers instituted these practices here. And during the colonial era, these like forces were predominantly preoccupied with controlling activities of oppressed groups like free Black folks, nearby Indigenous people, the poor, like all the people that they didn't want to be around them. And so that doesn't change much to this day. And then a really brief note, because most of this webinar does focus on anti-Blackness and how white supremacy and that dialectical, but I'd be remiss to not name, again, settler colonialism, how this nation was also founded on the removal of Indigenous people and genocide of Indigenous people. And police had a role to play in that, but also like the US Army and militias. So for instance, in New England, there were Indian constables to police indigenous inhabitants. In 1808, the St. Louis Police Department was founded specifically to protect settlers in that frontier city from Native folks. So I really wanted to make that note as we move forward to the next slide. Thank you. But when we really want to talk about the origins of modern policing, we can look at the antebellum South and the enslaver and enslaving origins of policing. Across this time period, like all the slaveholding states had instituted slave codes, which were originated in the colony of Barbados, the English colony of Barbados, which at base, like said, enslaved people are not, or enslaved property like are not people. They're considered property, and therefore it gave not just police, but basically white population inherent power to police control in Black bodies. But specifically, the earliest police forces were slave patrols called paddy rollers. And actually the word patrol that we use today comes from this, from an amalgamation of paddy roller and from that term. So in 1704, South Carolina has the first patrol, and by 1800, there were these patrols in every slave state. And again, they were primarily concerned with preventing rebellions and with runaway enslaved folks. Slave owners and the antebellum people living in the South were like constantly in hysteria about uprising of enslaved people. So they needed a force to clamp down on that. And so this is where we start to see the fusion of racial hierarchy, but also private property in policing, of how police uphold private property. Black bodies were considered property for slave masters and for the dawn of American capitalism. We can move to the next slide. And then in the North, it's a little different. For the formation of modern Northern states, forces begin as a response to a few things, but largely worker actions and strikes. There weren't quote unquote workers' rights at this time. So large corporations actually employed their own private forces and would use these forces to break strikes or to harass and intimidate and beat workers who were trying to assert their dignity. And corporations thought this was expensive, and reformists thought that it was unsavory. So voila, we'll have the public pay for these agents of terror. And we have state troopers instituted. And so you can see a picture there from 1909. And so in this area, we really see how police are upholding private property and the interests of people who own capital by basically policing everyone who was not, and folks kind of deemed as like the underclasses in society. we can move to the next slide. Thank you. And so just to quickly reiterate, these two building blocks of policing coming together, a racialized order of white supremacy that preserves and expands whiteness at the expense, of Black folks, Indigenous folks, and other groups, and then maintaining a class order, capitalism. So preserving and expanding class dominance of folks who control capital, and protecting the sanctity of private property. Police are often the agents of class war. That shows up nowadays by police being authorized representatives of like pretty much any shop that you go into. If you're trespassing, the police are going to show up. So this begins kind of this fusion of these two things. To the next slide. And then I really got this from Professor Wall's book, Police: A Field Guide, which I have right next to me. That just really quickly for folks to have in mind that the practices of policing are about maintaining order, which is always through the state's monopoly of violence, right? The police are authorized to use violence pretty much in any way they want to, and they're the ones that decide what is excessive, what is not, when is it justified. And then pacification is another tool. We're always in this country, and I just demonstrated like where those things come from slave codes. Like we are always under constant surveillance and securitization of public life by police. And we're all kind of used to that and we take it for granted. And then violence. The threat of violence is inherent in every police encounter. And moreover, abolitionists and critical scholars are getting us to realize how actually that is what policing is. It is violence work. It is not crime prevention or any of these other things that they tell us. It is violence. So in the next slide, the next two slides really show us that. I just want folks to reflect on a quote from Angela Davis, who says that police are emissaries of violence. And the next slide is really a startling statistic that almost 1 in 300 stops and arrests with police result in death or an injury that needs hospital care. And I could be mistaken, but police make over 80 million arrests annually and many more stops. So we've all have seen a police encounter, a police stop, a police detention, and more often than not, these end up with violence or serious injury. And thanks. And
Nathaniel, want to do a time check.
Thank you. I want to see if our speakers feel inclined to chime in at this point on anything that's been covered so far, because this slide is really just a brief overview of like what's going on after the Civil War and emancipation. When the slave codes morph into Black codes, which become Jim Crow laws, and lynching and segregation, all of these things are enforced by police. They're like these inherently nakedly anti-Black laws. The people that are supposed to uphold them and enforce them are police forces. And then we also see the rise of vigilante groups across the South to basically put folks who had just been enslaved back in their place. So most famously, the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, and many other groups that operate kind of mass terror across the South with tacit but also explicit police collusion and involvement. In many places, they're one and the same. And so there's just two examples on the side of this slide of even in this period, like around the Civil War and post-emancipation, of police forces like using violence to maintain power and to maintain the racial hierarchy of the South. The Wilmington insurrection, which was actually our first successful coup in the United States, where police helped residents totally overthrow a multiracial elected government. And we saw similar violence in South Carolina. So before I go on further, I'm wondering if, again, any speaker can chime in, but I'm also specifically wondering if our professors would speak to how the police kind of maintain a racial order, how it's like foundational to their origination. And or I can also like move on.
Actually, Nathaniel,
Share some
Dylan
notes.
popped something interesting into the chat. You might want to
Can't see the
ask him
chat
to
at all.
expand on that. Yeah, I just thought I'm monitoring.
You're calling on me, right?
Yeah, policing eviscerates the myth of the individual. Yes.
Well, first, let me say what's up. Thank you for inviting me to this. I'm just responding to your call out. My name is Dylan Rodriguez. I live in occupied Cuyatanga land in Southern California. I work at University of California, Riverside, which is right down the street from where the Riverside Police Department stole the life of Taisha Miller at a gas station in downtown. That's where I generally speak from. I'm not at home today. I'm in Atlanta today. But I just wanted to emphasize something that the presentation's already brought to light. Maybe put some key terms on it, some keywords on it, which is to say that when we think about the violence of policing, that it always has to be framed as asymmetrical. Asymmetrical. It is not a universal violence. It is not a mass violence, just like it's not mass incarceration. It is targeted. It identifies specific people, populations, and places that are going to be subjected to violence to the most acute and most intense, and for that matter, the most grinding low intensity forms of police occupation surveillance and bodily violence. To the extent we're talking about police violence, we have to always, if not explicitly frame it as asymmetrical, meaning anti-Black, colonial, misogynist, transphobic, Islamophobic, all this stuff, right? Although as you put it in the presentation, it's foundationally colonial and anti-Black, and everything else kind of emanates out of that. I just wanted to put that point of emphasis on it. And all I put in the chat was just, I wanted to kind of come at this notion that I think probably most of us in this room, especially with the aggressive, we used to call it affirmative action, the aggressive diversity hiring programs that many police departments have engaged in recent years, for that matter, recent decades really at this point. Most of us in this room are probably at most 2 degrees separated from somebody who's actually a police officer. And they might be fine human beings. But the point that I would make, just like in the military, is that the first thing that happens when somebody puts on the uniform is it completely obliterates and obsoletes their access to their individuality. And most people that have served in these militarized apparatuses will tell you that. And actually, if you care about somebody, a loved one or a family member, whatever, that is serving in the military police force, then number one, I think it's incumbent on you to try to make a constructive intervention to get them the hell out of it. That's number one, so that they are not in a violence and terror-making institution and therefore complicit in genocidal logics. And number two, support them, right? Folks need support because being in these institutions and doing that kind of work actually constitutes you. It's not just a job, it actually becomes part of who you are. And again, I've had many so-called non-traditional students, meaning students who come back to the university after a number of years, who've served in the military and police forces, who come back, who sit in my class where I'm talking about some of the, these very topics, and they testify to it all the time. And they say they're still going through the PTSD. They're still trying to get the cop that was trained and wired into their head out of their head, and they're constantly, in resistance and at war with it. So anyway, that's my initial comments, and I'm sorry for taking up so much time, but I just was inspired to respond to the presentation, to your question.
So this is Jamala. I wanted to piggyback on that if I could.
Absolutely. Don't apologize. This is what I wanted y'all to do.
No, it's okay, because I was in the same headset, and I think it was critical that the presentation that you just gave framed what I think is going to be the discussion. Because if we don't have like a common understanding of history, of terminology, then we're going to be all over the place. So I really appreciate the way that you set that up. I always have, and there's going to be somebody that says there's a good cop and there's a bad cop. So a bad cop would be what happened with George Floyd. that's an anomaly for some people. No, it is not. And so once we begin not isolating people and saying there's good and there's bad, but saying, as the previous speaker said, this is a system that's designed to do what it does. And those folks who are in it are going to act accordingly. And for white folks who are in the policing or military, there is an element of anti-Blackness that comes from just being in a society. So no matter if you think you're a good cop, that bias is there. I mean, let's just be real. And so for us, since the Ferguson uprising, we've been telling white people to stop saying that they wonder why the policing is different in different communities. Trust and believe that when we say we're getting our butts kicked on our side of town and that we stop 3 or 4 times a day for no reason, trust and believe that that's happening. There's no need for you to wonder why. This is part of the policing and the targeted policing that was spoken to earlier. So I'm saying that to say that it's a non-starter with most Black people to start saying there's good cops and it's time out for that. We need to focus on where we are in 2021. And I think, again, the frame that you gave us is where we are now. So what now? Which is led people to why we need to abolish the police or defund the police, because there's no salvation there if we understand the history. So that's my 2 cents. I wanted to speak some more to the slavery, the more of the union piece of it. But really, I think just starting off with that to say, let's not waste time talking about good cops and bad cops. They're, the system itself is entrenched and racist and unsalvageable.
Thank you. No, absolutely. And unless another speaker, like I'm trying to be the one
Actually,
that gets
there's
the
a stack.
experts.
There's a stack.
Oh, great,
Nathaniel.
great, great.
Just want to let you know,
Great.
because I'm monitoring the chat. I wonder if you want to just share a little bit about who Jamala is, because we didn't get to hear her intro, and then Yazin is on stack next, and then Aislinn.
Mama, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit?
Well, that's interesting. I thought there was a bio that was going to be thrown up in the chat so that we wouldn't have to do this. But basically, I'm an organizer here in St. Louis, Missouri, author of several books, one called Ferguson is America, Roots of Rebellion. So I'll just leave it there that I've been working on policing for 5 decades. And so I can say with some amount of clarity that it was a journey, because at some point I was in that camp that said, we can reform this system. There's some good there, but over time, believe me, we have tried everything, more training, more this, more that, cameras, you name it. And we've come to the conclusion that all of that is a waste of taxpayer money, that we need to just get on, start defunding the police, start dealing with human needs and human issues, and realize that that is not a place that we can reform.
Just
Come on
wanted
in.
to piggyback on some of the things that Dylan and Jamala named. I think the initial comment that Dylan had shared in the chat about the evisceration of the individual, I think Dylan was talking about the people who end up becoming either folks who join the military or the police and then go through these processes where they study social justice related fields in academia. I think that's a really important part of it, because in addition to this idea that maybe some people know like a good person who's a cop or a good person that's in the military, a lot of times the folks who serve the lower rank, the poor working class rank of these fields and these entities are poor Black and brown people. So we're not just talking about white cops, we're talking about white supremacist institutions, which is really important to distinguish because there are a lot of examples. For example, I'm thinking of people I've met, community elders, Latino community members who served in the Gulf War, and them and their friends served as undocumented immigrants under the premise that they would be given their citizenship. And of course, when they came back, they weren't. One of the elders that I spoke to, he had a friend who passed. His entire family was deported as soon as he passed, right? So you have these kinds of really, really insidious incentives that are offered to communities that are also suffering under racism, under anti-Blackness, under white supremacist institutions. Poverty is a racial issue, right? So when you have people who are coerced into these institutions that do use violence in a way to uphold a racial hierarchy, I think part of what happens in terms of appealing to the common sense of Americans is, oh, I see a lot of Black and brown people in these forces, therefore they must not be racist anymore, or these kinds of things. And what that does is it makes it so that it becomes hard to contest the idea that a police force is a white supremacist institution because it has diversity. It makes it hard to challenge, well, I'm seeing that a lot of poor racialized minorities are actually the people. So obviously it's more complicated than that, right? They wouldn't uphold white supremacy. And the answer is some do intentionally because, like Dylan referenced, they might become brainwashed, and some don't. Some are coerced and don't see another material path. You have kids as young as high schoolers and middle schoolers who don't get access to magnet programming, and at the same time will have recruiters come every other day to their campuses. So there's a lot of railroading that happens to ensure that these institutions get the diversity that they need on the surface level. But what's most important in all of that is the wealth that's protected and the government bodies that are protected. Those are the ones that are run predominantly by white elite rich men, right? Who have these very conservative racist agendas, who are trying to protect an institution that is those things. And even if there are higher ups that are Black, that are brown, that are queer, that are women, there's still people who have already been inaugurated into a system that is very racist. So I think it's really important when we're talking about the individualization, it goes both ways. And I think that's really important to name. And just really quickly, one other point, based on the presentation that you gave, Nathaniel, which I thought was a great, awesome synthesis to lead us in, was one of the points was about slave codes and the establishment of patrols being used to stop insurrection. And I think that is the heart of police. That is the heart of the military. It's control, and specifically it's control over enacting social and political change. And those things really matter because when you are talking about something like January 6th, the problem with January 6th isn't that these people are white supremacists. It's that they were enacting their white supremacy in the wrong way. You have a lot of people who wear suits, who wear ties, like Joe Biden, who have white supremacist values that look and sound very good. Donald Trump was not problematic because he himself is white supremacist. He was problematic because he was brash, because he was politically incorrect. There were also some classist approaches to how Donald Trump spoke, but Donald Trump himself, he did not represent ideas that were very different than any of the other American presidents. He continued a lot of the policies and programs that Obama had started before him. So I think what happens is when there's this individualization of violence, when we see things through individual acts, we don't see that if we are focusing on someone like Donald Trump, we're missing the fact that the United States is absolving itself of blame when it puts someone like Joe Biden in. Joe Biden is not doing very much different than Donald Trump. Within the first month of his standing in office, he attacked Syria, right? So you have these really similar approaches that they have. They just frame it very differently. And I think that matters because both of them, if we're looking at Trump and Biden in contrast to each other, these are both presidents who have very, very much supported very, very repressive moves against social justice movements. They both do not believe in radical ideologies that would lead to social justice for people. And I think that's really important too.
Thank you so much for dropping that knowledge. Yeah, Aislinn, please come in.
Thanks. Yeah, and I just want to thank the other folks that went before me for sharing really great insight. I think in many ways, when I hear I know someone or I have a friend who's a cop who's really nice, that kind of narrative, I always just knee jerk turn to the idea of a benevolent slave owner, and just the oxymoronic implications of that. What does that mean to be a loving person who is committed and a part of an institution that is built on some of the most horrendous forms of violence enacted against humanity? What does that mean to be nice, despite being a member of that? How relevant is that? And so that's where I always go. And there's kind of the obsession, which makes sense in the US context, of the individual, as if the individual can be separate from the collective or from the larger body, which is part of the mythos of American capitalism or US capitalism. But what does that mean to have a really nice slave owner? Does that then make the slavery okay? Does that then make the rape okay? The theft of wages, the theft of your humanity okay? And so it's let's look at the system and really push back against the individualization that is very commonly done in the United States, and really push to look at this is actually a system that is responding to particular governance demands. And I think, you, Nathaniel, really clearly laid out the logic why we have policing. It was birthed as part of the project of United States colonial power. And it operated in concerted and varieties of ways that included, obviously, the enslavement of millions and millions of Africans who were kidnapped. It also included and necessitated the genocide of millions of indigenous folks. It also included very complicated fights and battles with laborers as they emigrated to this country. There are very, very interesting, anyone who's interested in history, there's very, very interesting battles that happened around what is nativity, who is a native, and the concepts of who is an immigrant, that during slavery, which then of course erased, right, Black people from that discussion, but had a very interesting look at what does it mean to be a German immigrant, right? And an Irish immigrant who were racialized in a way that they are no longer racialized. They have been racialized into whiteness. And so looking at the project of policing as integral to the project of the United States and the project of creating whiteness as an identifier are all pieces of the puzzle that, that go together. And that, and part of what I really loved about your presentation was that it very clearly articulated, this is part of the ongoing project that necessitates US global capitalism, and specifically US capitalism. And when we then look at it from that lens, I think it helps to understand January 6th. And the role of Biden versus Trump, right? And the rush toward a more seemingly fascist movement against the normal, slower, bourgeois, acceptable mode of violence that we don't call fascist, right? Where the operating of Congress has is able to create a facade of democracy, right? That isn't threatened. And what is that about? And I think we can that represents a crisis that capitalism and U.S. capitalism has been in for some time. And so while we can pinpoint distinctions between Biden and Trump, and they have consequences in terms of lives, lost, right? It still is a part of a larger conversation about moving forward the behemoth that is U.S. capitalism and imperialism, and that what they are arguing about and what they are fighting about has nuance and importance, but it is predicated on the subjugation of millions and millions and millions of people. And that U.S. policing exists within that as its domestic army.
Nathaniel, Tyler would like to share, and then we need to move on to the next part.
Do we need to move on? No, it's going so great. And y'all have already brought up some of the stuff that are in my future slides, but I want to be talking least so that y'all can have the floor. Please, Tyler.
I'll try to be very fast.
You're fine.
I want to say thanks for the invitation and for being part of this with such great panelists. I would go back, I think, to Dylan's point about asymmetrical and add another word to think about. And this is thinking more about the micro interactions that we see between police and their subjects, is that it's a non-reciprocal kind of power. That policing is non-reciprocal, meaning and I'm using a phrase from another scholar here, but there's no such thing as an equal exchange between a cop and a non-cop. That the entire relationship of policing on both the larger macro level of society that Dylan was pointing out about the asymmetrical targeting of various populations, but you can even see this in the most micro situation, that there's no such thing as an equal exchange between a cop and a non-cop. There's another way of saying it too, that even, we're talking about violence, but it's also the threat of what we would think of as direct physical violence that organizes all of the relations that police engage in on a day-to-day level. So, there's an old saying that, no one goes to jail voluntarily. That if it appears they go voluntarily, right? Meaning even if it looks like a peaceful interaction, it's still fundamentally structured by violence. We all know if you simply drag your foot, and of course this is the asymmetrical and the racialized component, because it's going to differ based on the identity and the subject, position, and the demographic of the person being accosted by the cops. We know that if you drag the foot or you talk back or you don't, that police have an enormous amount of power to handle that situation however they see fit in the situation, in the moment. And that is a discretionary power that the law grants police. And so I don't know if that's helpful for the conversation, but the other thing here too, since we're focusing on good cops and bad cops, and then trying to push people to think structurally and systemically, organizations change individuals, and individuals rarely change organizations any. You can see this on so many levels, right? And I teach in a sociology department there are a fair amount of students that want to be police officers, and I always try to open up and tell them that and I have students like Dylan come back years later, and we they come into the class and we have these conversations. I've known a lot of students that, one of the issues I think, policing and prisons have taken on such a dominant mode in our political economy and even the cultural imagination. A lot of people are seduced in thinking that that's the way to do good, right? They've been convinced that good is to join the police force or whatnot. And I always try to tell them that, if we have to then take that structural or institutional approach of defining policing as kind of a violent institution that's built on all of this history that you've laid out, and the other great speakers have highlighted, that we have to think in these terms, in terms of not about individuals, because we all know that even when we're a part of organizations, we often do things that we don't actually morally or politically agree with. The institution kind of takes us over. It's we end up enacting organizational policies even if we actually complain about it or don't actually feel good about it. So I think there's something here about thinking about policing as a whole, as a very particular type of power that is not necessarily meant to be accountable to law or reform measures, as Ms. Jamala talks about, that if policing is this power because it has to kind of help, and Aslan's point there at the end of I think you said something about like the strong arm of the state or the enforcers. To do that, policing has to have an enormous amount of autonomy to handle it, meaning to be free from all kinds of rules and regulations, right? James Baldwin called this the arrogant autonomy of police, right? And he didn't mean that by just individual cops. He meant that as an institution. Policing is meant to be an autonomous, separate, it's supposed to be apart from oversight and reform measures and even the law itself, right? So I think that is part of the conversation here and thinking about policing as a kind of structural force. Not as quick.
Didn't need to be quick. This is y'all's time. Absolutely. I want to respond to all the points y'all made, but we don't have time for that. And my brain might overload from joy and giddiness and the complexity and nuance. But yes, but thanks for talking about whiteness and white supremacy as institutionalized, as institutional, and policing might be one of the most obvious ways and powerful ways that happens. There are some more slides, and then I know we want some time for a Q&A. Folks have already basically said the most important things from the slides, but I'll move through them really quickly. Maybe I can be through them in 3 minutes, and then we'll get back to some more discussion. Can we bring up the next slide? And if we can't, I can also just ask questions.
We could maybe, I'm just wondering about jumping to the reform piece, because that kind of came up in what Tyler was just saying a second ago. Might be.
Exactly. Okay, absolutely. Yeah, so much came up: militarism, reform. Y'all laid out kind of the duality between military and policing. This slide is talking about, I'll just call it a massive expansion of policing and I guess white supremacy on steroids. The federal government in the mid-20th century just gives tons of money to policing. Why? Folks have already said it. To, again, continue to respond to uprisings, social revolutions, mass rebellions that are ongoing throughout this century. And bipartisan forces shaped the need for more police as rising crime when it was actually about social control. We decided, the federal government, and it continues to this day under Joe Biden, as folks have laid out, who wants to, pump more billions of dollars into policing. We responded to some legitimate social problems like poverty, like inequality, with policing and so we treated it rather than social and economic conditions that are criminogenic in their social outcomes. We deliberately address these things with policing in prisons instead of healthcare, instead of education, instead of quality livable neighborhoods. And then of course our presidents Johnson and Nixon, give the police lots of weapons, lots of money. We can go to the next slide. just a point on militarism, and then to reform. One more slide, please. And I'm definitely not reading all of this, but just, yeah, the earliest police forces were comprised of militia, former active militia members. Today, the ranks of the police are disproportionately comprised of military veterans. They're arguably more likely to abuse force, if you can abuse force. And part of reform efforts to make police quote unquote better was to make them act more militaristic. But this only, further entrenched repression, especially when the military is used at a global scale, like has been said, for the same logics of white supremacy, of upholding capitalism. So you can't fix one broken thing, or you can't fix something broken with something that's broken. Thank you. Of course, we've heard lots about supremacy within police departments. There's individual racists, but then there's also like structural racial forces. Not gonna read all of this either, but just there's more and more information coming out about like quote unquote racist cops, the ones that are explicitly maybe the bad apples, but not as much focus as on white supremacy as institutional. And then we know that white supremacist groups are continuing to quote unquote infiltrate, or I would say get closer, hug their buddies closer, municipal police forces. So yeah, let's move on to, which I think is probably the more or really interesting, this notion of reformism. And Dylan Professor Rodriguez wrote a great piece as part of Kaepernick's Abolition for the People series on Medium about reformism. I think probably all have spoken or written on this topic. You can go to the next slide. This is just a really small timeline of like efforts to reform. None of them have really worked. We've been doing it since like 1939, which leads us to 2021, where Congress can't even pass a reform bill. And the one they're going to give us is not the one that people actually want, because it's not actually fundamentally going to destabilize the white supremacist project of policing. I want to finish out the slides and then just continue the conversation. Skip the next slide and go to 24. Perfect. This is the last thing I'll speak to. That this year, there was an incredible report from the National Lawyers Guild and others that basically have charged the US with being guilty, which is something we all know, right, of committing war crimes, but specifically because of the activity of policing. And so like in a human rights framework, like folks are calling on the ICC to prosecute, not that that's going to fix things, but to prosecute the US for its ongoing genocide of people of African descent. So, and just last week, the UN, the Human Rights Commission, like called out the US, like, stop denying racism, pass reparations, do something about policing. So we're really, it's kind of, they're only 79 years late, and one of our speakers was really involved with taking the issue of police brutality and specifically torture to the UN, which I hope we have a moment to speak on that. But that's what I have for the slide presentation. So I want to get back into conversation. I'm curious. Actually, let's go there. Ainsley, would you actually talk about your role with We Charge Genocide in Chicago, and how y'all were able to, and now you head the Chicago Torture Justice Center. I did a lot of research and followed We Charge Genocide, which was calling out the Chicago Police Department for its decades of torture, right? I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, about how you see the historic reparations package, direct financial compensation to victims of torture, also memorial, also education in public school curriculum. Have you seen that as can you assess, like, how is that chipping away at institutional white supremacy in Chicago? But I'm just, really curious and would love for you to speak to your role and share that with the participants, because it was historic and monumental.
Sure. So in 2015, Chicago City Council passed the country's first reparations ordinance for survivors of Chicago police torture. And in the ordinance, there includes a very small monetary compensation for a very small number of survivors. So the city recognized and admitted that CPD, under a particular detective, former commander, whose name was John Burge, tortured at least 120 people. This is the number that the city admitted to. That number is much, much, much larger than that. And only between the years that he was employed by CPD, which was 1972 to 1991. And in that, he trained dozens and dozens of cops that then formed torture groups, some called the Midnight Crew, and others had nicknames, and tortured people throughout primarily the south and the west sides of the city. And after decades of survivors and their family members organizing and trying to get the admission entered into court to prove that they had been tortured. And by torture, I mean torture by the definition of the United Nations. So John Burge was trained in advanced interrogation techniques in the Vietnam War and in the Korean Wars, and used those techniques on people in Chicago, which included electrocution, mock executions, electrocuting, electroshocking people's genitals, beating, putting cigarette burns on people, a wide swath of violent techniques were used. And so it was really survivors who led this work in demanding that their stories be heard. And that included going to the United Nations, petitioning the United Nations. The United Nations then accepted this petition and included it in their Committee Against Torture report, which then helped the movement in the city push the state to abolish the death penalty. And that happened around 2004-ish. And that was led internally in the prisons by folks who were on death row, who had discovered through a study group that they were all survivors of torture, led by John Burge. And then by the time We Charge was created, and We Charge was created in May of 2014, after CPD tortured tased to death Dominique Franklin, community came together to figure out how to respond. And so the decision was then to, in honor of the report, the 1950s famous petition called We Charge Genocide, that we would then compile a similar report in that vein, identifying that CPD is actually torturing and guilty of genocide of Black people in Chicago, and with particular emphasis on youth. And then we sent 8 young folks to Geneva, to the United Nations Committee Against Torture to testify in October of that year. And then once they came back, Rahm Emanuel, who was our mayor at the time, was pushed into a runoff. And so we decided to use the fact that he was in a very vulnerable position. And for the first time, the mayoral seat was pushed into a runoff in 50 years, and use that to force him to pass the reparations ordinance. And so at that point, it had been stuck in committee for 3 years. And so we were able to do a targeted push, about a 6-month campaign that it included a whole bunch of protests, train takeovers, we did a curriculum, whole bunch of different things. And then we were able to use that momentum and the crisis that resulted in after the assassination of Laquan McDonald's video was released, to force him to pass the ordinance, and that's what happened. And so what I'll say is that that was a huge win, one of the biggest wins I've ever experienced. And it was not enough. There are hundreds, and if we truly are honest about torture, the number is in the thousands. And it wasn't just John Burge, but what was transformative about the reparations ordinance wasn't the money, but it was the fact that we were able to create the center, which is the first and currently only center in the United States dedicated to domestic torture, and that's by federal design. The other torture centers are not allowed to treat domestic torture survivors, and we were able to pass the curriculum. And those things are really, really transformative. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. For sure, and still the problem persists, right? I'm curious, and if folks want to go on Stack again, they can, because again, you tell me where to go. But I'm also curious from Mama Jamala again, because we see that when we're talking about policing and police violence in response to rebellions, like in Ferguson, the narrative is often that and even from in the last year in Minneapolis, like instead of seeing these movements and these moments, these incredible moments as like political demands for total transformation of not just policing, but like society and the white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, homophobia endemic throughout society, it's sidelined as just a riot. And so I don't want to frame it. I'm wondering, and even though these rebellions have been some of the most like poignant and powerful revolutionary acts like throughout our country's history, but we're still fighting for police to stop killing us. I'm just wondering if you could share about being on the ground in Ferguson, and you mentioned you wrote a book on Ferguson, The Roots of Rebellion, and how does it, and also we saw an incredible like military presence on the ground in Ferguson. So again, what does it mean that instead of seeing Ferguson as like a call for completely transforming and dismantling racist systems that are still with us today? Yeah, can you reflect on that?
So I always appreciate the question, because it's always this thing of riots versus rebellions or uprisings, and we deliberately try to use other language because riots is a thought that maybe there's some kind of guilt on both parties, like both parties are guilty, and so they just no, these are uprisings in response to material conditions on the ground. And so often what you find is that the rebellions are ignited by some act of police, bullying or brutality. And so, when we look at the Kerner report in 1968, it clearly says these are responses to the conditions on the ground, whether it be poor housing, poor education, poor everything in terms of a quality of life for Black and brown people, and even I would say poor white folks. So, when I think about what, the whole, we charge genocide and the fact that, these things are happening in our country. We're not talking about like, the Middle East or somewhere. These are torture chambers that are happening right amongst us that we are paying folks to do to us. And I remember Chairman Fred often said, like, why are we paying police to brutalize us? I mean, it's an oxymoron for sure. It's counterintuitive. Like, we're paying people to torture, kill, occupy our community. Why are we doing this? So I think of all places, Ferguson, because people know that what happened there was happening in St. Louis and all the municipalities around. But the fact that, just like in George Floyd's case, that we actually were seeing some things that we hadn't seen before. We're seeing a kid lay in the August sun for hours. That imagery is a very powerful imagery, just like seeing officer with his foot on the neck of a person till he literally died. Those are images that are extreme for sure, but all in between there is happening in Black and brown communities. And so I wish that we could have done more to amplify the report that came out of We Charge Genocide and the discussion around a John Burge, who exists in many other communities and have done damage. And so when we think about like connecting the dots, those people who were forced and tortured into admitting guilt when they weren't guilty is what led to the whole nother movement around wrongfully convicted and incarcerated, and actually ramped up the whole energy around ending the death penalty. Because think about it, if these people have admitted to killing somebody and they didn't, and then they're facing execution for admitting something they didn't do. You just see how corrupt the damn system is. I mean, it's just like, just rotten to the core. And so one of the things I just wanted to end with is by saying the piece that you had in your slide about the social order, but specifically the reason the police get involved in a really violent way is when there is an upsurge for social change. So whether, and you mentioned St. Louis's first police department in 1808. I mean, you know how entrenched this department is because it's been going on for centuries. But then you had, for example, in 1877, the railroad strike, which was the first general strike in this country. And it was white and Black railroad workers that was striking. Can you imagine how powerful that was? And so those folks were like, oh, no. And so it's squashed by the military and a put together police force, because the police force that was here wasn't going to be enough for that kind of action. So in many ways, every time we see a multiracial, multifaceted, upsurge happen, you see the white lash come down. And so I really want people to remember that this is what this is all about. They do not want any unification of the forces of social change and social justice and racial justice coming together. And so we have to have that in the forefront of our minds, that we are not supposed to align with each other. We're not supposed to have solidarity for one another's movements. And there is a force that's going to make sure that doesn't happen. If we fall into the game.
Exactly. And that force is police. Thank you so much. Yeah, Dylan, do you want to, Professor, know what you prefer?
Dylan's cool. Yeah, well, I would just add to what Ms. Jamala and what Nathaniel, you were just saying. The force is police. The force is also reformism. Reformism is essential to both the historical origins of the police as a modern institution, and is absolutely indispensable to reproducing police as an institution and police power as, the grounding anti-Black colonial force of most nation states, not just the United States. So, you brought this up in the overview, but I just wanted to encourage everyone to reflect on where some of us and our people and loved ones were about a year ago, right? About a year ago, it was a certain historical high point in abolitionist and proto-abolitionist rebellion. We were all over the place, in the streets, in rooms, on the phone. I mean, we were everywhere talking about remaking the world in the image of an abolitionist reality, an abolitionist present tense, not just a historical kind of image or a kind of perpetual future looking image, but a very present tense notion of what it would be to live an abolitionist now. That's where we were a year ago. What I am obsessed with in this moment is the fact that we are on the ground floor of a counterinsurgent reformist wave. And this reformist wave that we are currently in has one primary, maybe one exclusive concern. That concern is restoring the legitimacy of police power and the prestige of the police. That is the sole purpose of the reformist moment that we are in. When I say prestige, I'm using it in the sense that Frantz Fanon, the great anti-colonialist liberationist writer, writes about it when he writes about the prestige of the colonizer. You know, that sense of being suprahuman, transcendent, that kind of prestige is what produces and reproduces the colonizer's deadly, normalized, violent power. It is no different than the police and police power. So in that sense, I know we were saying earlier that reforms never work. I want to say they actually do work in a particular way, right? On the one hand, they don't work in the important ways that a lot of people pin their hopes and aspirations on them. Not only do reforms not work, they oftentimes make things worse. And I want to just repeat here and y'all should repeat it over and over again at whatever dinner table or coffee shop you're in. There is no consistent evidence that police trainings, diversity and tolerance seminars, and any of these things succeed in remotely slowing police violence, specifically anti-Black, misogynist, racist, transphobic, Islamophobic, and other forms. There's no evidence in any consistent way that police trainings slow those forms of violence, much less stop them. And there is, in fact, pretty significant evidence that in many cases, in certain types of police departments, those trainings make those forms of asymmetrical violence worse, right? Which makes sense if you think about it, because if these folks are being forced into these trainings, they don't respond well to that. On the other hand, the way reformism does work is it works as counterinsurgency. What it installs is a certain ideological structure that tells people that the horizon of social change is that which is understood to be achievable within the limits of existing institutional structures. That's what reformism is. It is the opposite of liberation. It is the opposite of anti-colonialism and colonial, and freedom from colonization. It is the opposite of abolition. It is the opposite of the entire history of Black radicalism and Black liberation struggle, right? That's what reformism is. That's different than reform, right? We might be tactically okay with certain types of reform because they maybe slow down and maybe prevent certain types of casualties. I'm talking about the political ideology of reformism that says that reforms are the only legitimate way to create social change. Reformism undermines and criminalizes all other forms of social change movement, including and especially abolition and Black liberation struggle, not to mention, indigenous forms of anti-colonialism. So I just want to emphasize how reformism is counterinsurgency against those forms of movement. It is no less impactful than the forms of militarized counterinsurgency that you see in police and military mobilizations against people and communities that are moving against their vulnerability to obliteration and state-induced suffering, right? Counterinsurgency cuts across all these different registers. And in addition to reading Tyler and David's book, which I'm on like my 4th or 5th round of reading it now. It's a great book because it's organized as keywords. You all should just have it on your shelf, have it on your desk. Some great kind of real definitions. I'm not even gonna call them counter definitions, real definitions of keywords that are indispensable to us right now. In addition to that, I encourage you all to go, this is gonna sound weird, go to the US Army's website and download their counterinsurgency handbook. It's a free download. And if you take a look at how the US Army defines counterinsurgency, it has everything to do with what we are talking about here, right? You can make some modest revisions for the terms they're using and think about counterinsurgency inside the United States. It's not just in Afghanistan, not just in Iraq, not just elsewhere. It is right here inside the United States. And reformism, this thing that we're talking about here, That is primary because what it is doing, it is a struggle to restore legitimacy, restore the legitimacy of police power and the prestige of police. So I think that's one of the primary struggles that we're in the middle of fighting right now. We got to recognize it as such. I'm gonna shut up.
Thanks, Dylan. Yazan, I think you're up.
Yeah, I think one thing that I wanted to name just in the presentation, the last slides that you were showing, Nathaniel, about timelines, something, Jamala, that you ended on, and then Dylan, I think this last point, if we look at the timeline of when you have police emerging in the United States, and specifically when you have the emergence of the prison industrial complex in this country, it is on the heels of anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist movements around the world. So if we're looking at specifically the year of 1968, this is the international worldwide student strikes. This is when the leftist ideologies are at their height, right? Like these kinds of things ideologically are on the precipice of taking over, of toppling these different institutions around the world. So I think when you hear someone like Dylan right now saying that this is about counterinsurgency, I think something that's really important is social change and political change are the constant threat that necessitate policing. And like Ms. Jamala and Dylan were referencing, when you have this sort of reform, it's always in the vein of preservation, self-preservation. It is never in the emotional or political belief in the idea of actual wellness or safety or access to rights for people, right? And I think specifically that timeline, Nathaniel, that you put up, one thing that was missing that I actually think is really timely for right now is 1994. And in 1994, you have the creation of community-oriented policing services, which emerged in direct response to Rodney King and the outcries around Rodney King and the LA riots. And community-oriented policing services, the reason it matters so much right now is because at the time, it's when he was a Congress member, is Senator Joe Biden at that time, is the person who fostered this program. And it's a multi-million-dollar grant program geared towards the exact types of trainings that Dylan is talking about. So community-oriented policing services do multicultural trainings. They put police in direct conversation with religious leaders, with social justice organizers, and they often give money to police departments under the premise that they are building relationships with community. So a classic example is in Minneapolis, there's a program called Bike for Kids. It's cops, like Bike for Cops or something like that. And it's police officers who are granted these several $1,000,000 from community-oriented policing grants that are supposed to be passing out bike-related supplies and bikes to poor Black neighborhoods in Minneapolis. The thing is, what this also normalizes that doesn't get named is police are in the neighborhood every day doing bike patrol. So they are driving in this really cute ice cream truck that has bike supplies and bikes, and they're supposed to be driving through these neighborhoods to be passing out these things. But what that actually does is it makes it okay that police are constantly in neighborhoods that have said, we don't want you here. This is in response to the fact that folks in Minneapolis were like, we do not want police here every day. So police were like, okay, then we'll come here under a different premise. But at the end of the day, you still have Black youth who are constantly under the surveillance of police. And I think one other thing that's really important is with this last point, Dylan, that you were making about counterinsurgency, it's not about the theoretical connections between counterinsurgency. It's not that police are theoretically doing the similar work to the military. Since 9/11, one of the major focuses of the United States government has been connecting the ties between local police departments, federal agents, and the United States military. So you have programs like countering violent extremism, targeted violence, terrorism prevention, these things that Joe Biden, again, at his time under Obama, is one of the major founders of. And these are programs that use Department of Homeland Security grants to fund local nonprofits, religious institutions, and local police in community social service bases that have specific indicators that target political ideologies that are anti-state, that are anti-police, that are anti-US imperialism. These grants that are supposedly social service grants require nonprofits to bridge the relationship between community members and police officers. And so if we're thinking of reform, if we're thinking of it in relation to counterinsurgency, this is exactly one of those examples, right? Reform is always about assuaging community outrage, but still maintaining legitimacy. And I think specifically in this year, right, when we're talking about the January 6th moment, this year, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence just released his newest threat assess report, threat assessments. And at the top of those lists, it's still anti-capitalism. It's still racially motivated extremists, right? So still folks who are organizing around anti-Black racism. It's folks who are anti-globalization, folks who are anti-war and anti-imperialist. These are the people who are named extremist threats to the United States government. And so I think it's really important to think about, yes, environmentalists, and there's always this reference to, oh, but we're also including white supremacists in this. White supremacy and the KKK have been on the FBI list since before COINTELPRO. These are always organizations and groups that have been listed as extremist threats, and it's always for showing face. And so I think that's really important because you are never going to weed out the white supremacy that operates on the day-to-day like everyone is talking about. It's that these groups, whether we're talking about the KKK, whether we're talking about January 6th, Boogaloo Boys, these folks don't wear white supremacy the right way, but it doesn't change the fact that the United States is still going to be at war with Iraq, Afghanistan, right? It doesn't change the fact that the United States still relies on globalization and exploitative labor at the expense of entire cities and countries around the world. And so I think when we're thinking about what it means for the United States to reform its policing structures, to reform its militarization, I think it's really important to think about what are all of the violences that the United States perpetrates that still go unchecked. If Obama releases a cursory statement mourning the lives lost to police violence, what does that mean if there are still folks who are dying from poverty because of racialization, right? And so I think thinking about this and thinking about the fact that it's always social change and political momentum that are the targets, that are the extremist threats, in line with white supremacists, right? What does it mean when you call Palestinian activists who are arguing against Zionism? Those people are labeled extremist threats in the same way that a handful of white supremacists are called extremist threats. What does that say about the political legitimacy of Palestine? What does that say about the political legitimacy of people arguing against anti-Black racism, right? It completely nullifies their arguments. It nullifies the legitimacy of their struggle when you're putting them on the same extremist threat as white supremacists, who are people who are enabling the state. And so I think these kinds of conversations are really important to think about, and thinking specifically about Joe Biden's role, because he is now someone who's been doing this work for 30 years. He is someone who's been reforming police and making multicultural white supremacy part of the police system for a very long time. And I think those are just some really important things to center in this conversation when we're thinking of the Biden administration today.
Yes, yes. Y'all took this to such a dope space. Sorry, I keep dropping out. Professor Wall, Tyler, did you have a chance to chime in yet as we close?
Oh, I was just gonna pick up on the points that Dylan's making about reform and trying to offer or encourage maybe I think what I hear him saying is that what we think of as reformism is often like it's a recalibration of violence or the perception of violence. And so, it goes back to thinking of the police power as kind of this broader structural force that we've been emphasizing violence, but it's also part of the pacification of the counterinsurgency is hearts and minds. And that goes to the cops and Hassan pointed out the program in '94. That police have all kinds of strategies, and part of it is a hearts and minds. It is the coffee with the cop, the passing out candy at the parade to the children, and we need a language and a certain kind of sensibility to be able to criticize that or to critique that or to for what it is, which is a certain kind of hearts and minds campaign to create certain types of subjects or certain types of ways of identifying a certain kind of intimacy with the state. And on that, I like to think of what we also often think of reform as like an inoculation. And in this case, inoculation can be defined as kind of like admitting a little bit of bad to hide a whole lot of evil, right? For lack of, meaning reform is often, sometimes it is the cops admitting fault, right? Oh, we had too many white officers. We need more Black and brown officers. So there's an admission of guilt or admission of a problem, or, our training has not been up to par. So we need more training. We need, this and that. There's a certain admission. We did, and you saw this with the George Floyd murder, where so many cops came out and actually identified. I remember being in one meeting and I saw a cop speaking, and he said, like as if he was proud of himself, let's call it for what it is. It's murder, and so there's a constant kind of, ideological. It's not just the repressive state apparatus, but it's with this ideological apparatus that produces this image of police, it be it community policing, right? All of a sudden thinking that community policing is somehow going to solve the problem. And that's reform, in terms of always promising some better and brighter future without ever changing the structural component of policing or the mandate of policing to kind of fabricate a particular type of order with whatever means necessary, right? It never wants to give up that power. And I think that's what's so promising about the rise. I mean, it's not been an immediate rise, just even though it's been more visible the last year or so with abolition, because it is calling into question the police as we know it as a whole. It's a political program that recognizes that inoculation, that those admissions of mistakes and a little bit of bad as actually part of the logic of police from the get-go. That's how it reproduces its power. The police power reproduces itself by admitting some faults and saying we did bad, and yes, we were this and that, while ultimately propping up the entire institution, that prestige. And I would say too, when I think, I think the magical component of reform we've really seen playing out that Dylan was speaking to, where, when they burnt down the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis, there was a poll, that came out after that a little bit that said 54% of U.S. citizens found it justifiable. And I remember talking to some other, friends that are engaged on these issues, and we were, I was kind of amazed. Someone that's been studying this for a while, amazed at just the mass level of anti-police sentiment that was kind of circulating then. And it was like, it felt like the possibilities were endless and we were really going to see something. And at the same time, there was that question of like, how will the police recuperate themselves? And I think that's kind of what we're in now, where there is this recuperation of the prestige of police that Dylan's talking about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks to, as we draw to a close, and thanks folks for staying on a little longer. Thanks so much to our speakers. I think we unintentionally or intentionally, my colleagues and I, are drawing folks into our community conversations to where we can dive deeper into these questions that folks have been raising that we didn't have time to get to. Or maybe we didn't want to. My takeaway is how we absolutely need to understand the foundations and the origins of white supremacy and policing. But as y'all's last points is really, it's critical right now in this moment where abolition is kind of more popularized than perhaps ever. We had the largest uprising in our nation's history, that we need to be attuned to how policing and whiteness continues to perpetuate and reproduce itself. As you were just saying, like, that is what institutions do. They want to maintain themselves. So that is like our mission right now, is to actually abolish it. Thank you again so much. I'm going to pass it to my colleague Laura to close us out.
Thanks, Nathaniel. Thanks to all of our fabulous panelists. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. There was so much information that was shared. It is, I was writing, I couldn't write fast enough to get down so many excellent points that I hope that you will join us when we have our part 2 on July 22nd, so that we can continue this conversation and go more deeply into the historical context, the structural components that sort of uphold policing as we know it today. Where are the directions that we can go that will lead us away from the structural policing as we know it today, and what would be the alternatives to allow us to all live safely in our communities, regardless of where we are, what our economic status are, whether we're Black or brown or indigenous or anything else. So you have the opportunity to come back. And we hope you will join us. I believe that the registration remains in the chat. I don't know if it was put back in, but I'm sure we'll send it out to you again. The recording for this evening will be made available to all of you, and you'll have the opportunity to register, and I'm sure that the link will also be sent out. So thank you so much. We had over 100 people join us from about 30 different states all around the country. So we know that this is a topic that resonates with many. But thank you all for your time. And we look forward to you joining us again, hopefully at our next session and the community conversation where we can have more questions and discussion on July 22nd. Thank you and good night.